Medakiapi, Cherith Smith, Imachiapi Kishto, Si Changu Oyata Elbate, Ma Lakota Kishto. Hello, my name is Cherith Smith. I am from the Rosebud Sioux tribe of South Dakota, and I am an enrolled member there. I am also Blackfoot. I'll go ahead and introduce myself in our Blackfoot language as well. Oki, Nistu Netanuku, Cherith, Nimtoto, Bikani. What I just shared is that I am from the Blackfoot Confederacy of Brockett, Alberta, and that is a neighboring reservation tribe with the Blackfeet here in Montana. So this evening what we are going to be doing is we're going to be sharing some of the cultural recipes that we share with our community over at All Nations Health Center. Today, as part of our team with the diabetes program, I have Erica Rubino here, and so I'll have her introduce herself and also what she does here with All Nations Health Center.
Hello everyone, my name is Erica Rubino. I am not native myself. I am actually originally from São Paulo, Brazil, and I'm very excited to be with you all today. I am the registered dietitian and wellness care coordinator over at All Nations Health Center, so I work very closely with Cherith in our diabetes program and providing nutrition services to all of our clients and patients, focusing on prevention and also diabetes management.
So one of the things that we love to do is we love to share cooking, food sovereignty, and also help to target and improve food security for our Native population here in the greater Missoula area. One of the things that is part of the programming that we do is to harvest our traditional foods, which includes during bison hunting season, we will often incorporate a bison harvest as part of our education curriculum. In addition to that, we have a very strong gardening program that we have been continuing to grow, and over this last year we have also incorporated raised bed gardens for our community members. Part of what we grew in our own parking lot includes some of the ingredients that we're going to be using today. So the recipe that we will be sharing with you is from my own Lakota people. It is called Bapa Wohanpi, and that means dried meat soup. I'll walk you through each of the steps and the ingredients while Erica Rubino shares the nutrition content that we also try to help our community members and our patients incorporate as part of some of their own recipes, diet, to help strengthen their food sovereignty and food security. So we're going to walk through the things that I have on the counter here, and I'm going to go ahead and start over on the side that has the squash. So one of the things that was indigenous to our Native people here, even in our northern plains areas, included squash. And so some of the things that we plant in our garden are different types of squash. This one here is a Hubbard squash. And this is something that not only are we going to use tonight, but I'm going to share a little bit of how we prepare it, how we preserve it, and hopefully that's something that other families might incorporate as part of what they do. So we also have corn, and this corn is locally grown here just in and around the Missoula area. One of the things that the Lakota people did, we not only were gardeners in some areas, but we also did a lot of trade with the surrounding tribes who were also gardeners. The Arikara, Mandan, and Hidatsa were known for their corn raising and also their corn trading. So this is something that we've tried to incorporate, and you can see here how this particular corn, what I did with this is after it was harvested, then my son and I blanched it. Once it was blanched, then I just peeled back each of the corn husks so that we could braid it. And once we braided it, then it's now ready for drying and storage. And this is something where we could take those kernels off and we could grind them, or we could boil them. We could do a lot of things, and this would last us throughout the winters as far as how long the preservation of this corn would last. So we also have a turnip. And turnips were something that were a staple for our Native people. Not this type of turnip. However, we did have specific turnips that we would often gather across the plains. And one of those plants we call timsala. And timsala is a root, and that root had a little bulb on the bottom, and that was one of the main ingredients to our Wohanpi, our soup. You can see here how it's been peeled and diced up. So we'll use this ingredient. One of the other ingredients we'll use this evening is wild rice. And this particular wild rice we purchased from one of the tribes in the Great Lakes area. I'll have Erica share more information about where we purchased this wild rice. However, you can see once cooked, the wild rice really does increase in volume. So many of our families oftentimes share with us that being able to budget and being able to afford the foods that help to prepare these meals can be something that is a financial strain on them. So one of the things that we try to do is we try to incorporate how can we use the things around us to help us with some of these ingredients and to reduce that cost. So one of the things that we like to do is we like to share with families how to create a bone marrow broth or a soup base, soup stock, by using very inexpensive ingredients. So you can see here what we have is we have bone with some different, you can see it has a little bit of meat attached to it, but this bone also has bone marrow in it. And I'm going to put it in this pot because we'll go ahead and get this started while we move through the rest of the ingredients. And then this is a delicacy for our Native people. So this is actually a bison tongue. And one of the things that I'll do is I will braise and slowly simmer a bison tongue. And that bison tongue will be used for one meal, but the broth that is made from it is just powerfully packed with bison flavor. Even a cow tongue will have a very strong beef flavor that just makes a wonderful stock, and you can see that stock right here. So some of the ways that I might flavor that stock might be by adding some peppercorns to it. I usually won't add much. I'll add a few peppercorns. I might add some sage to this, and we do have sage in the very end. And we'll just grab a few of these leaves. I might add some juniper berries to it, but just a few things like this. And then we'll fill it with water and let it simmer. And I'll have Erica do that while I finish explaining these other ingredients, and then we're going to start walking through some of the nutrition content. So the other thing that we did is, once again, we didn't have refrigerators. So being able to have a pantry full of ingredients was something that we had to look at other ways of being able to store foods. And drying was one of the main ways that we preserved our foods. So this here is a piece of bison. And what I wanted to show is that on this bison, you can see that it has the long grain of the bison muscle. So one of the things that we do with our classes and throughout the year is we will work with our community members to show them how to not only cut bison for drying, but also provide them with the supplies they need and show them how to make dried meat. Dried meat is different than jerky in that we didn't use all of those different preservatives and sodium and things like that. So one of the things that we will talk about with diabetes is how do we decrease sodium content in our food. One of the ways we can do that is trying to help reset our palates to where they were before. One thing my grandparents used to tell me is they would say all of those other things that we added to our foods, like all that salt and all of those things, you couldn't taste the actual ingredient anymore. You couldn't taste that food. So we'll walk through these things, and before we add any kind of salt, we'll have them taste it. We'll have them trying to identify those different textures and those flavors that come straight from the ingredient itself. So this is dried meat, and this was made from this particular bison, and it has absolutely no salt. We just dry it, we cut it thin, right along that grain, and then we dry it. Once it's dried, we can store it for a very, very long time. But this is something that we'll use in today's soup. So as we move our way down, we get to our corn. And in this case, this is hominy. So the type of corn we had in the past is not the same type of corn that we have today. Today's corn is a lot sweeter. It has a higher starch and sugar content. And the corn we had in the past also had more of a hard hull that we would have to break down before we would get the nutrients from the product. So this particular corn is called split hominy, and it's just corn that has been treated with an alkali solution so that the hull of the corn is able to come off, and you get the actual inside of the corn that has more of the nutrients in the corn. And if I were to just back up a little bit and just talk about that, so for instance, flint corn. Flint corn was probably something that was most common, and flint corn included what a lot of people will know as Indian corn, the multicolored corns. We didn't have the same kind of process in treating that corn that they do in the corn that I'm sharing with you today. What we would often do is we would use like a hard wood ash that would be combined and soaked with that corn just to help get rid of that harder exterior, and that would help the nutrient value absorption of the corn increase. And so it's one of the things that in any of our recipes we'll often incorporate hominy as well as our regular sweet corn, but thinking about hominy in that traditional way. So this corn here, this hominy, was 1 cup, and we soaked it overnight, and then I simmered it for a couple of hours on the stove, and you can see that it absorbed all of that liquid. So the next ingredient I have here is the dried Hubbard squash. And traditionally, what we would do is with our winter squash, we would peel off that hard exterior until we had just the squash itself. One of the ways I'll do it is I'll just cut that squash completely in half. And then I'll lay it upside down, and I might actually just show you a little bit here. Let me grab this one. But I would take the squash and cut it right in half like this. Then that half, I might lay it down like this, and with a sharp knife, just cut off all of the outside hard skin. Once just that orange part was exposed, then I would take a knife and I would just cut either rings in about 1/2 inch thickness, or I would spiral it so that I would have one long piece of squash, and then hang it on a stick outside in the heat for a few days until it dried. In this case, I used a dehydrator, and that's one of our shortcuts that we can do today, is we can use a dehydrator. So once it's dehydrated, Not only does it take up less space in your refrigerator or your freezer, but it stores for a long time. And then I just break it up into smaller pieces that we use in our soups. And we just break it up as we go. So there's other things that we have done along the way. And that includes adding different things like aromatics from a regular grocery store. So when we think about food sovereignty, we think about what are those food sources that we have just right around us in our environment. And wild onions is one of the ingredients that we can get here in Montana. So if we gather them, we'll use them. But onions are pretty plentiful. We grow them in our gardens. So today we just have a regular onion. If we don't have a traditional root vegetable or an indigenous root vegetable, we'll use alternatives like carrots, turnips, potatoes, things like that. But we're always trying to think of how do we incorporate more of the vegetables, keep the sodium low, and think about using locally produced things when we can. And that's where our gardening comes in. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start working our way through building this recipe, and then we'll talk about some of the nutrition content. So we're going to start all the way back here. Okay. So our, let's say bison stock is simmering right now. And with that bison stock, we're going to just let it simmer, and I'll bring it a little bit higher. Okay. And the first thing that we're going to look at is the meat itself. So when it's dried, it's called Bapa in our Lakota language. And I'm going to let Erica talk a little bit about the nutrition content of bison versus other types of meats.
Yeah. So bison meat is a traditional food here, and as we know, is a game meat. And generally speaking, bison is going to be a lot leaner than beef, for that matter, whereas the flavor can be quite similar. When we compare bison meat to other game meats, such as elk, for example, or deer, nutritionally, it's actually quite similar. They're all pretty similar in the amount of calories per serving, for that matter, but really where the difference is in the fat content. So when we're looking at bison meat, it will have a little bit more fat than elk or deer, where deer will be the leanest one of all. But obviously that does depend on the animal itself. It does depend on the piece that we are eating, for that matter. But protein-wise, as you know, animal meats are going to be a really, really rich protein source, mostly complete. They're all about the same as well. So when you compare 3 ounces of cooked bison meat, elk, and then deer, and they were all top sirloin tenderloins. Those are the closest ones I could compare. They're all about 24 to 26 grams of protein each, and between 2 to 5 grams of fat each. And then the different types of fat in that case, they're not too different. They're just about like 1 to 2 grams of unsaturated and then saturated. When it comes to carbs and fiber, there is none, as there usually is not with animal meats. So you don't have to worry about that too much. And then when you compare bison meat, for example, to chicken or some other things that we might see regularly in our kitchens, you might notice that it is also pretty lean in comparison.
So what I've done is I've added the bison stock that's made with the tongue and the bone, as well as the pepper and the sage directly into the pot. Then I've broken up the dried meat. And one of the things to know is when we are making dried meat, we cut off all of the fat. It really has absolutely no fat attached to it, because that just helps with the preservation process. So once that's going, I just pull it up to a low simmer, and I'm going to go ahead and get that going here, maybe. There we go. Low simmer. And then we're going to take the next dry ingredient, because we're adding the dry ingredients that need longer to boil and simmer in the pot. And we're going to take the, this one is the squash, and we call this wagmu. In our Lakota language, we call this wagmu, squash. We're just going to pour it in there. And then that is going to simmer and boil. And then we're going to take a look, and let me just make sure I've got the next ingredient. We'll take corn, wagmeja. And this, once again, was 1 cup that turned into this much. We're only going to use probably half of it or less. And once again, this is what we soaked overnight, and then we simmered so it was ready to go. So that was probably about, what, half a cup, 3/4 cup?
3/4 cup.
Something like that. So now that's all going to simmer together. And then we are going to add our onion. And that provides that aromatic, and that'll simmer together. And then for our root vegetable, once again, different types of roots were common for us, like timsala, even the wild potatoes. So for a wild potato, we called that blo. And those things still exist. It's something we still continue to harvest. But we'll add these along with the turnip so that those can all simmer together. Very simple ingredients, but the flavor profiles all together as they just simmer together just become really fragrant and add to that earthiness of the Wohanpi, the Bapa Wohanpi dried meat soup. So we're also going to then take the wild rice, and we're going to add this wild rice. And we don't need a lot, probably just do 1 more scoop here. And then we're going to let it simmer. This kind of has a little bit of a slow simmer here, but when we simmer this, probably would simmer about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit longer on a low boil. And we oftentimes will look at, well, what other things might we do with this? If we were unable to grab turnips, we might just use carrots. If we didn't have winter squash, we could use summer squash. There's all kinds of things that we could do with the soup. And once again, if we didn't have dried meat, we could just use regular stew meat. But we definitely try to encourage using the different meats that we can through wild game hunting and bison harvesting for our people to help reduce that cost. So I'm going to have Erica tell you just a little bit about the nutrition of the soup while it simmers, and I'm going to check on our beef stock here.
Thanks, Cherith. So as we already talked about the proteins in this recipe, we can talk about the turnips and some of the vegetables next. So for the vegetables, or for the turnips specifically, we're using ones that we found at the regular grocery store. If you want to pass that over, the turnip over to me. As you can see, you can find this pretty easily at the grocery store. I got this earlier today. And turnips are going to be a great ingredient to add in foods because they don't really add many calories or many carbs. And when we're working with our patients with diabetes or our clients with diabetes, that's always something we're thinking about. So turnips can be a really great substitute for potatoes if you're trying to reduce the carbohydrate content of it. And honestly, it's a great way to kind of mix it in there for kids to try different foods as well. And they just add a really nice mild flavor to the soups and adds a little bit of crunch in there too. Nutrition-wise, it's just a pretty moderate amount of carbohydrates, about low carb. It's low in carbohydrates. It's only 2 grams for every 1 ounce, so it's really not much at all. So it's a really great diabetes-friendly food. And otherwise, there's really no protein, no fat in it, and there's a little bit of fiber. And I was able to find information on prairie turnips as well, and the nutritional differences are pretty significant in that one. It is a lot more caloric, so a lot more calories per serving on that one, and also a lot more carbohydrates, just for you to see how different the different types of vegetables have turned into over time. The next thing we have here are the squash. So as Cherith mentioned, she is using Hubbard squash. So this one over here that is from our garden at the clinic, which is pretty cool to see here. And Hubbard squash is going to be a little bit starchier, or it has more carbohydrates than our regular summer squashes, like your zucchinis or your yellow squashes. So that means it'll have more carbohydrates, so just be mindful of that. It also makes it just a little bit hardier. Personally, I really like winter squashes for that reason. And then the color of it too, when you see that orangey, that reddish, that yellowish color inside of different vegetables, you can almost bet that it's going to be a great source of vitamin A, and that comes from that color itself. Let's see, we also have corn here, or hominy specifically, and Cherith already went into a little bit about hominy, and what hominy is corn that has been nixtamalized. Am I saying that correctly? So like she said, it's been soaked in an alkali solution, and that could be wood ash, lime, or lye. And what it does is it breaks down that outer coating of it, the hull, so it makes the nutrients more available for us to eat. And what it does too is it allows for the corn, when it soaks up water, to just like puff up into 2 times of the size. So there's a lot of benefit to using hominy, but the other thing is that you might not have to use as much in comparison to regular corn in a recipe because of that. The nice thing about hominy too is that you can find it in grocery stores pretty readily in the canned food aisle. That's where I find some for myself. So that's something you can try at home. One of the other ingredients in this recipe that Cherith is making for us is wild rice, as you can see here. And this is what we would call true wild rice, not the wild rice blend that you typically see at the grocery stores that is usually marketed as wild rice blend. From my understanding, this wild rice is also known as manumin, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this is actually from a tribe in Minnesota. It's from the Red Lake Nation that we purchased. And I actually cooked this earlier today, and it took a very long time, especially when you compare it to regular like white rice or even brown rice. This took almost an hour of boiling on the stove earlier today. And that's because this wild rice is truly hearty. There are so many more nutrients in this, and one of the significant differences is going to be the fiber content in this. So when you compare the same amount between white rice, true wild rice, brown rice, and then wild rice blend, you will see that this wild rice here has 6 grams of fiber per 1/4 of a cup dry, whereas the other ones will have 2 and then up to 4. So this can be a phenomenal grain for you to include with meals, because you're not only getting a delicious grain, true wild rice, but you're also going to be more full, more satisfied because of that fiber content, as well as because of an increase in protein. And the other thing is that with this true wild rice, when you cook it, it expands almost like 4 times its original volume when you compare it to white rice or brown rice. So when you compare it cooked, you can actually you don't eat as much wild rice in order to enjoy it in comparison to the other ones, because it expands so much. And I realize I'm just going to correct myself. The fiber content in this is going to be about 2 grams per serving for each of these, for the wild rice, brown rice, and the wild rice blend, whereas white rice will only have 1/2 gram of fiber, so pretty significant difference there. And the protein will be 6 grams for this one here, so much different there. And the other thing we also wanted to talk about was the broth itself. So Cherith was talking about the different ingredients that you can use to make a broth here, and one of the things that you can use in your soups or your stews at home is either regular beef or chicken or whichever broth you're using versus bone broth. And the significant difference in that one is going to be the protein content. So when you look at regular beef broth and beef bone broth, there is a difference between 9 grams of protein in bone broth and only 3 grams of protein in beef broth. So if that's something that you're looking at, adding that bone broth will increase the protein content of your food. And when we talk about diabetes and eating healthy for diabetes, increasing that protein content and kind of combining it with other ingredients, other macronutrients, it really makes a big difference for you in that. Otherwise, everything else is about the same when it comes to the nutrients.
So one of the other things is that when it comes down to the expense, because these are things that we were harvesting throughout the year, the only thing that we actually purchased was the turnip,
The rice,
and the wild rice.
and then I guess the hominy as well.
So the hominy, if I were to share what that cost breakdown was for the hominy, and it would depend. If we used the corn that we had dried, then we would have had no cost for that. With the hominy itself, I buy that in bulk, so it was about, let's say, $5.75 for about 5 pounds of hominy. And we only ended up using maybe a quarter cup of that dried hominy. That comes out to cents, just a few cents. And then once again, that could be used many, many times over for many, many different meals. So thinking about when we're looking at food sovereignty and food security, just being able to appreciate a lot of these things were grown not only by us, by our clients, our patients, but also by local growers around us who were able to help us along this way. So this soup is going to simmer for about 30 minutes, and then it will be done. And in the meantime, we usually use that time to tell stories, to visit, to be able to share experiences along the way. Cooking is a time where we come together. We also share that food is medicine, okay? And so the things that we eat are there to nourish and restore our body, and thinking about food in that way. I was going to share a recipe that we call gabubu bread, which is a pan bread. However, I chose not to do that this time only because I really wanted to focus on indigenous foods and the foods that we could grow ourselves. But it's important to note, especially during November, when we think about our indigenous populations around us, how things have transitioned over the years. So it wasn't that long ago when we were doing mostly gathering, hunting, and then for those tribes who gardened, harvesting from their garden. As we moved through the reservation period, where we were no longer able to do those things, we became reliant on a lot of the foods that the federal government provided for us. That food oftentimes was not nutrient dense. It was really not that good for us. So growing up, I participated in commodity programs and federal food distribution programs that included things like corn syrup, flour, sugar, salt, lard, canned meat products, grape juice, all kinds of things that were simple in carbohydrate, high in sugars, high in sodium, high in fats. So one of those was being able to take those ingredients and then create something to help our families survive. So when I think about fry bread and I think about gabubu bread or pan bread, I think about resiliency. And that's one of the things for us to recognize, is that even if that is not an indigenous food for us, it is something that we adapted, and incorporated into our culture in the help to feed our families, feed our children, and it was part of our survival story. So I just wanted to share a little bit about that this evening. All right, thank you so much for joining us.